Okay, thanks, Cole. Hello, everybody. Well, as usual, there's a lot going on. I guess the issue that you're probably all aware of and following, which has implications, not just for Palestine and the pro-Palestine movement, but for all our rights in the United States, is, of course, the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia graduate student who was kidnapped effectively by Homeland Security. Uh, it was kind of disorganized. It looks like they presumed that he was on a student visa, which he was not. Of course, he was a green card holder, that is a permanent resident. And they scrambled very quickly to find another reason to threaten his expulsion. And that's based on a law from the height of the Cold War and the McCarthy period, the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act, which is a very long and complicated bill that's been amended and taken to court any number of times since then. But the provision that they're citing allowed for the deportation of residents and even naturalized U.S. citizens who were considered to be anarchists, communists, or supporters of communism. And this was part of the sort of 10 or 15 years of the height of McCarthyism in the United States, when many people were deported, jailed, or persecuted for their political beliefs. So it's not just an issue that affects this individual or the Palestine movement, but it's a matter of a threat to the rights of everyone, particularly political dissenters. And by the way, in case McCarran strikes, a chord of memory for some of you, in 1950, the McCarran-Walter Act was 1952. In 1950, the famous McCarran Act, among other things, set up concentration camps for alleged subversives, especially communists and communist sympathizers. And these camps still existed into the 60s and the early 70s, as far as I'm aware. So this is a very threatening situation. I'm not an expert on the law, but I've been reading about it. Apparently, the charge can just be made by the Attorney General or the Secretary of State, and even when there is no alleged crime of any kind, as there is not in this case. But as a permanent resident of the United States, my understanding is that Khalil does have rights for due process. They're not as much as in a criminal case, but he has to have hearings and so on and can be represented by a lawyer. And to hinder that, he was spirited away to Louisiana, very far from New York City, which makes it much harder for him to get legal representation or to be in touch with his family. So this is a very threatening event, and it's part of this broad assault on the pro-Palestine movement in the United States, especially at the universities. As you also know, Columbia in particular has been the target of a lot of repression, organized pressure by its alumni donors and the federal government. And Trump recently announced that he was canceling $400 million in research grants to Columbia. Some of you don't know, most of our universities are partially dependent on federal grants for research in various fields. And of course, 60 other universities are also threatened with reprisals by the Trump administration if they don't somehow address the issue, the largely bogus issue of anti-Semitism on their campuses. Even the Jewish community is divided on this because back in the day, many Jews were victims of McCarthyism, but the stalwart pro-Israel branches of the Jewish community organizations, the ADL and the American Jewish Committee, are cheering this arrest and cheering and asking for more repression against pro-Palestinian speech. But others have spoken out, and it's interesting to note that the New York judge who issued a stay of any effort to deport Khalil is, of course, Jewish and has been attacked on that basis by pro-Israel Jewish organizations. As you know, the drill, not a true Jew because he doesn't go along with Israel's agenda. Getting back to Gaza, even though in theory the ceasefire is in place, Israel violates it every day. It's not at the same scale as their major genocidal assault on Gaza, but 1, 2, 3, half a dozen Palestinians are killed every day in Gaza by Israeli military assaults. And as you know, Israel continues to forbid the entrance of humanitarian supplies into Gaza. It's now more than a week. And just yesterday or the day before announced that they were cutting off electricity to Gaza. Now, most of the electricity had already been cut long before this, immediately after October 7th. And the Palestinians in Gaza, there are electric generating plants, but they were either bombed or have gone out of commission because there's no fuel allowed to supply them. The main recipient of this last little bit of electricity that was allowed into Gaza was a water desalination plant, which provided much of the potable water for the central and northern part of Gaza. And now not only there's a food shortage, but there's a water shortage as well. So this is a very dire situation. Meanwhile, Israel, of course, continues to resist any attempt to carry out its obligations under the ceasefire agreement that it itself signed. And the U.S. is giving very mixed signals about that. On the one hand, supporting Israel's intransigence. On the other hand, now negotiating directly with Hamas and Qatar. And it's part of the Trump modus operandi of having numerous and sometimes contradictory efforts going on at the same time. It confuses us here in the United States. And of course, it's certainly confusing the Israelis who don't know what to make of it because different parts of the Trump administration are saying different things. There was quite a panic when in an interview, Bowler, one of the Trump envoys in the Middle East, announced that he was representing the United States and wasn't an agent of Israel. And this was regarded as scandalous, as a threat to Israeli influence in the United States. And of course, Witkoff, the other real estate magnate from New York, is also negotiating in the Gulf and in Moscow. And sometimes their statements are contradictory. And by the way, we should note both Bowler and Witkoff, of course, are Jewish and from New York. And again, it indicates divisions within the Jewish community in the United States and dissent from the sort of Israel first kind of point of view. And all of that was, the threat of that was highlighted in a recent Gallup poll, which showed that Israel's opinion in the United States was at its lowest in history. A minority of the people who responded to the poll said they supported Israel or approved of Israel. And especially among Democrats and young people, it was overwhelming that there was more support for Palestinians than for Israel's position. And it only, the moderation of the final results were only because the Republicans are exactly the opposite. There's very high level of support for Israel among Republicans to sort of partially counteract what the Democrats are saying. But among young responders, only 9% supported the Israelis over the Palestinians, and 48% supported the Palestinians over the Israelis, and the rest, wanted to be even-handed. So these polls are quite worrisome for the Israelis and show that their efforts at persuasion in the United States are failing, and therefore they have to rely much more on repression because that's the main tool that they have at their hands to keep the Palestinian movement at bay. Israel also has been violating the ceasefire with Lebanon, with the backing of the United States. And there's some rumor of talks to be held, direct talks between the Israelis and the Lebanese, which has never happened under U.S. auspices. And the Israelis are hoping the U.S. will twist the arms of the Lebanese to normalize relations with Israel. That may or may not happen. Of course, Israel continues to invade Syria and occupy larger and larger parts of the southern part of Syria, even as the new government, which is the consequence of U.S., Israeli, and Turkish and Gulf intervention in Syria, has been carrying out large-scale massacres of religious minorities, particularly Alawites in the coastal area near Tartus, Latakia, and Banias. Reports are that well over 1,000 and possibly 4,000 Alawites have been massacred by the new Syrian government and their allies in that area. And of course, you don't read much about it in the mainstream press, for sure. Finally, the Heritage Foundation, which is closely allied with the Trump administration, it's kind of the Trump brain trust, basically, issued a long report about U.S. military relations with Israel, advocating all kinds of closer ties and support for Israel, but within that, advocating that U.S. financial aid to Israel be phased out over a period of 20 years from now. And this caused another complete panic in Israel and its supporters in the United States. Reminder, in normal times, the U.S. supplies $3.8 billion a year of direct military aid that was negotiated by Barack Obama for 10 years. The next year or two, it will have to be renegotiated. And the Heritage Foundation is suggesting, yes, we should re-up it for 10 more years, but over the course of 20 years, basically phase out U.S. direct financial support for the Israeli military. Needless to say, that's very worrisome, but a good sign. People are starting to raise this issue. And as you all probably know, even if Israel were not committing war crimes, there is no imaginable reason why U.S. taxpayers should pay a significant part of the cost of its military. Israel, again, I remind you, is a wealthy country with a higher gross national product per capita than most countries in Europe. And yet we subsidize their military, whereas other countries on that level, we sell arms to, not donate them, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. So good for the Heritage Foundation. And how this will play out, we have yet to see. I guess in terms of what's going on in Congress, we'll deal with a little bit later. So that's all I have for now.
Thanks, Jeff. Questions and comments? Serena.
Yes, I read recently that also aside U.S., Germany gives a lot of money in compensations to Israel. So are they doing anything, and do you want to talk about that?
Well, it's a different situation. The Germans are basically buying a get out of jail free card for their Nazi history with Israel, and it's a different thing. They do sell weapons to Israel, especially submarines. All the Israeli submarines, including nuclear missile submarines, are made in Germany. But as far as I'm aware, their direct financial aid is to compensate victims of the Holocaust in Israel, a lot of which, by the way, is diverted and stolen by the Israeli government instead of going directly to the victims.
And then they go and point it to the Hamas is stealing from Palestinians.
Yeah. So lots of other countries sell weapons to Israel, of course, but the U.S. is by far the biggest and the only one that donates weapons courtesy of its taxpayers to Israel, as far as I know.
Okay, thanks. Pat?
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, what wild days. I never thought I would heard you say good for the Heritage Foundation. Whoa.
Or
Second,
good for the Trump administration to the degree part
right.
of it is seems to be advocating for a ceasefire.
Right. Two, what do you make of the fact that they said that they are recommending we decrease the amount of aid that we're giving to Israel? And three, do you have any updates on the Esther project, which actually
No.
people in CD3 are getting very interested in?
No. So yeah, so if you read the report, it actually is a very mixed thing. They're advocating much closer military ties with Israel, just suggesting that maybe the Israelis could pay for their part of it on their own, the U.S. So it's not something progressive, but just even raising the idea on the right of phasing out U.S. financial support for Israel is meaningful, because if that idea gets out in public to a larger degree, of course, people will start asking the question, what sense does it make? And of course, it doesn't make any sense, not only on a moral ground, but just, in terms of the money, so in that sense, hooray for them. One cheer or two cheers for them. No Democrat, by the way, ever suggests such a thing. So that's part of the crazy political moment we're living in.
Okay, thanks. Abby.
Jeff, what's your evidence for the idea that the Israeli government is stealing money that Germany is sending to the survivors?
Oh, lots of reports, including in Israeli newspapers. The money is funneled through the Israeli government, and they are free to allocate it as they see fit. And there are lots of reports of a lot of it not actually getting to the needy victims of the Holocaust in Israel and elsewhere. This is not something new, by the way. This goes back, Norman Finkelstein wrote a book about this years ago called The Holocaust Industry, in which he documented how the money that's compensation for the victims has been redirected or stolen for other purposes. So it's not a new story at all.
Hey, any more comments and questions? Otherwise, we will move on. Okay, thank you. Just going to adjust the recording 1 second.